Let me get one quick round of comments from all of you. I'll need you all to be really, really sort of to the point and, and ask questions or make a very clear statement to be able to contribute to the debate, because I want to get, dig a bit further on both your experience in Jordan's and elsewhere. So I think there is a roaming mic, but let me start it to begin with. I'd like to ask my colleague, Christina Bennett, who leads our humanitarian work, to offer some initial reflection, also based on the wealth of sort of experience that colleagues of ODI have in this field.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta, for allowing me the first question. And thanks very much to the panel. I mean, to Heaven's point, I think it was all very entertaining to see what was going on in the debate on Twitter, but it's so much more impressive and interesting to be able to hear the nuances of this debate live. So thanks very much. I have a question, and this is really based on the back of 2 years of research that ODI, that HPG has been engaged in on the livelihoods of refugees and from the refugee perspectives themselves. And my question is perhaps for Alex and also Manjula. I mean, a lot of what you propose in the book, for example, Alex, and what I'm hearing today is very state-centric, very high policy level. And I guess my two questions to you would be, what is the role of humanitarian principles in what you're proposing? And then secondly, how can you factor in the perspectives of refugees themselves in what you're proposing, and where is there room for integrating that perspective into the pilots that you're currently undertaking? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. Let me see if there is, I can go to David straight, but also others I'd like to hear. David Kudur from the OECD, who's been working on issues of employment and different kinds of migration again for a long time.
Thank you. Well, I'm not an expert on refugees, even though I work a lot on migration and development, but I was kind of impressed during the discussions. Obviously I agree on the fact that refugees should have access to jobs and on the issue of skills, which is very important, but it seems to me that in this discussion we are pretending that refugees are going to stay forever. And it's true that, integration is very important, and a significant share of them will stay in the countries of destination. But refugees, by definition, they don't have vocation to stay forever in the countries. Hopefully one day the country of origin will get better, and they will be able to return to their countries. And I think that in all these discussions we should also have some strategies to think about how they can contribute to find jobs when they go back, how they can contribute to the development of the country of origin, which is a very important topic in that sense. And therefore, jobs are important, but also training to think about return in some years.
Thank you. So return, can I take maybe a couple of others on this side, if there are any? Please, there. Yeah, there. Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to go first. I'd like to take a slightly different...
Introduce yourself, sorry.
Sorry, my name's Paul Curry and I work as a humanitarian consultant. I'd like to take a slightly different angle. I think the critique of the book has been sort of well made by Heaven. My question comes from the economic side, in the sense that I think there's a fairly long history in the literature that special economic zones and similar activities are actually suboptimal as development tools in and of themselves. And that often, frequently, I think OECD and the World Bank have both published on that, and frequently actually divert resources from other economic development within the national context. So it seems to me that you're potentially proposing a double whammy, that it's a suboptimal outcome for refugees, but also a suboptimal outcome for the host country. So while individual refugees and perhaps host nationals may benefit, that in the medium to long term, the overall impact is likely to be negative. So I just wondered if you had a particular response to that.
Thank you. Let me take one more, and I want to get back to the panel because there is a lot on the plate. And if not, I can go straight back now, and you'll have another opportunity later. Okay, Georgina, at the back.
Hi, Georgina Sturge, ODI. This hasn't necessarily been mentioned on the panel today, but it was something which I came across in the book, and that was that the international legal architecture for refugee migration is perhaps not fit for purpose. I was wondering if any of you could reflect then on how you see the future of international law on this topic.
Okay, thank you. So let me get back to the panel. Let me start with Alex, of course, so that Alex has a chance to respond to some of the critique and reflections from Heaven, but also these issues of scale. And what I picked up from Manjula is that a lot of the propositions of the book look at the potential to create jobs in neighboring countries and in effectively countries of transit or closer to home. I think Manjula reminded us that they may not be the countries or the economies where it is actually possible to generate, particularly the scale of jobs that we're talking about, and opportunities may be elsewhere. And then Sarah's point about the fact that there can be a mismatch. When there is a mismatch between demand and supply and the talent that is on offer, again, they may or may not work in relation to some of the countries that we're talking about. So, Alex, over to you. And then once we've done this initial response, I'd like to hear from you a bit more on your experience in the Jordan experience, not just on the design and the original intention, but what is your assessment a couple of years down the line on how it's going?
Okay. There's a lot on the table.
Yes.
I'll do my best to deal with it. I think there was very little that was put on the table that I disagree with. And I think it's important that the book doesn't become a sort of straw person characterization of one part of the book. I think we spend probably at most a chapter and a half on the Jordan example in a 9-chapter book. There are many other ideas in it that are about jobs and other things about reforming the refugee system. The things that Heaven said, I think I agree with and the book agrees with. We are scathing of the characterization of the refugee crisis in European terms, and we're trying to point to a parallel crisis that's unfolding in other parts of the world that host the majority of the world's refugees. We're very clear on the fact that far more refugees are in urban areas than camps, and refugees are bypassing the camp system. Our argument is not that most refugees are in camps, but the default response of the humanitarian system continues to be a camp-based logic that doesn't play out adequately in urban areas. We also highlight sort of examples going back over sort of 30, 40 years of UNHCR doing great work in promoting refugee self-reliance that provides historical examples of good practice and bad practice. And I think Heaven's right to say the book slightly foregrounds the special economic zone proposal, in part because that's how Paul and I started working together, and it's one we've been actively involved in. So we wanted to be able to reflect on that in the book. But I think it would be a mischaracterization to say that's our only proposal, or that we are absolutely committed to the idea that it works. We've been involved in developing a pilot that's innovative. We're committed to wanting to see that pilot play out, to look at what works and what doesn't work, then take stock, and that context matters and it's not a solution to all situations and all places. Let me come to some of the questions. Christina, the question of refugee perspectives in livelihoods. Now, nearly all of my academic work includes a lot of focus on refugee perspectives. So the Refugee Economies project that I'm involved in Kenya and Uganda has involved in Uganda quantitative research with surveys with over 2,000 refugees, large amounts of ethnographic and qualitative research. It's all about looking at refugees' perspectives in markets, how they develop entrepreneurship, looking at those experiences and incorporating them. In my work on refugee innovation, it looks at bottom-up approaches to innovation, not sort of imposed top-down products and processes, but the way in which we can engage refugees' own creativity, talents, aspirations. Now, the Jordan example, I think, is a very interesting one because it's so difficult to do that, because it's such a constrained political environment, and that makes it a very hard situation in which to innovate. There's a huge amount of bottom-up capacity, a huge amount of skill, talent, aspiration on display. In our report on bottom-up innovation, we look at a very small cross-section of that in the Zaatari refugee camp and highlight the opportunities that offers. Now, the book is a little bit state-centric, partly because part of its audience is a state policy-making audience, and that's partly who we're trying to influence to create more political space to allow those bottom-up opportunities to come through. And I think IRC has produced a really interesting report where they've collated data recently looking at the perspectives of Syrians in Jordan and what they aspire to do economically. And one of the things I think they rightly highlight is the Jordan Compact is imperfect, but it provides a political landscape on which new ideas, new innovation, and new opportunities for refugees can begin to build. David, I think it's absolutely right to suggest that we need to think beyond the immediate situation of hosting. What's going to happen in the long term? How do we think about return, ultimately, but also moving people out of those situations. One of the proposals in the book, and I think this hasn't been discussed in many of the reviews, if any, is we propose the idea that there should be some kind of cut-off, that staying in limbo year after year is absolutely unacceptable, and that we need to focus resettlement not only, although it's important, on the most vulnerable who shouldn't remain in neighbouring countries where they can't get access to their rights, but there should be a cut-off, whether of 5, 7 or 10 years, beyond which coordinated resettlement takes place to get people out of situations where the prospect of going home is not available. And I think the kinds of examples we point to are things that Sarah pointed to, that the migration system, a variety of visas, migration visas, family reunification visas, can and should be available to diversify the opportunities people have to leave. But we need to use resettlement far better. In terms of the return, one of the central arguments we also make is that providing jobs, an economic opportunity, and autonomy to people in exile is a way of supporting and incubating the post-conflict reconstruction of an economy. In a country like Syria, that's had its economy wiped out during conflict, the conflict will come to an end. Historically, we know conflicts do come to an end. But if that population, a large part of it, has been idle, lacked access to education, lacked access to employment, then the people who go back will probably struggle to rebuild that economy if they go back at all. So I think we need to break down the silo between the humanitarian system and post-conflict reconstruction and development, and recognise that how we treat people in exile, whether in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, or in Europe, matters for what happens when they go back. One really good example of this, I think, is Gambia. Again, an example that's been characterised often as economic migration, but a lot of people have been fleeing an authoritarian regime. Gambia recently had successful transition through elections towards a more democratic regime, and people are going back. They're going back and starting to look to contribute. So I think we need to think about breaking down that silo. Paul, I think it's a very valid point. Special economic zones have a mixed record, not only in terms of their human rights record, but also in terms of their economic record. They create artificial economies. They can introduce distortions. The question of whether they're sustainable and viable is open to question. But where they have a successful record, it's often on a particular time horizon. It can be used to create opportunities through tax breaks, through trade carve-outs, for infant industry to emerge, but it has to be able to stand on its own legs. You can't have that protection from the economy indefinitely. Now, Jordan is also in an economically difficult situation. It's aspiring as a middle-income country to make the leap to manufacturing, but how it does that when, frankly, China does manufacturing far better than it is likely to do it, is a real economic challenge. And if we're going to say hosting refugees is an opportunity for Jordan, as well as a development and security challenge, then we need models that are going to get it from that starting point onwards. The Jordan Compact is not just about the economic zones, it's about jobs outside the zones. And I think that's been one of the political successes, to take a kernel of an idea that's initially been quite constrained, that in practice has gone beyond that model. Now the challenge, of course, and I'll say a bit more about this, is as it stands, we're not getting the levels of investment needed to make it sustainable and viable. We're not getting the levels of multinational corporation investment. And part of the reason might be that investors, on some level, realise that creating a temporary artificial economy is not going to be economic, sustainable or viable. So I accept that as a valid critique of the model, and we're going to learn more from the pilot. Georgia, your question about the international legal architecture not being fit for purpose. I think at no point would I suggest we should get rid of the 1951 Convention. It's a really important document. It safeguards the rights of refugees. We wouldn't get as good a deal again. But we need to also recognise the limitations of law. The reality is that preaching to governments that are not complying with refugee law is for the most part not changing their practices. That many of the main host countries around the world are not even signatories of the 1951 Convention. So where it's an effective tool, and it is in some cases, use it. We've seen over the last few months successful litigation in Kenya, for instance. We've seen courts be successful against Trump in the United States. Use courts, use the legal framework, but we've also got to have an international system that has political skills to look for areas of mutual gain and shift politics and understand domestic political constraints. We've got to have a system that can look to economic and development opportunities to make it work. So we've also got to supplement that legal regime, as Heaven's work has pointed out as well. The people moving across borders today are not just 1951 Convention refugees. A lot of people are in a grey area. Boundaries are blurred. Most refugees today are fleeing not just tyranny by states persecuting them on an individual basis, but fragile states. Half of the world's refugees are from Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia. And at the moment, those people are struggling to get consistent recognition. The recognition rate for Eritreans between France and Sweden couldn't be more stark. For a long period of time, Germany wouldn't recognise people from South Central Somalia. So we need to supplement that somehow, not necessarily with an additional protocol, but possibly with soft law frameworks that make human rights norms relevant. And I've written about that elsewhere. Let's get to the economic zones in Jordan, because that's what you really want to hear about. It's not working as it would in an ideal world. So I'm really comfortable acknowledging that, because that's the empirical reality. We've put out an idea, we've brainstormed it, we've played a small part alongside the politicians who have taken the lead in getting that pilot underway. I feel good about that because I think we're learning. I think it's created job opportunities for some people. Is it perfect? No. Is it going to work on its current trajectory? Quite possibly not. But here's what I think we know so far. What I hope us to be able to do is do a serious impact evaluation to learn. Nobody's done that yet. We need the data before we get to any serious rollout stage. But the fact that a country that imposed serious de facto barriers to jobs has so far provided 40,000 work permits in the first year of the project, I don't think is too bad. I think, Heaven, you had a line in your review, and I'm sorry for introducing this, and it was something along the lines of, the project proposed to create 200,000 jobs in the first 5 years. It's only created 40,000 in the first year, therefore it's not on track. 40 times 5 is roughly 200,000. That's not to suggest that we're going to reach 200,000. It's not to suggest that the target shouldn't have been more ambitious if it was going to be on track, but it isn't too bad as a starting point. The problem is that many of those jobs are moving informal sector jobs to the formal sector. And to make it work, and serious investors have worked with us to come up with this, we'd need to move from about 2.5% growth a year to about 8%. At the moment, the EU's trade carve-out is in the garment sector. That's working in some of the economic zones where certain groups of Syrian women want jobs in the textile sector. It's not working for people that don't want to work in textiles or in other sectors where additional trade carve-outs and serious investment would be needed. In terms of refugees' responses, the media coverage that's been carried out, the interviews that have been done by IRC suggest mixed perspectives. Some people are very happy and comfortable. Some people feel let down and disappointed. So this is a chance, as I say, for us to learn. It's not been perfect so far. Is it better than it was? I think probably. How do we know that? We don't from rigorous data. We need to find out before we move to considering this as anything like the answer. But my hunch is it's got to be context specific.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Let me ask all of you in the room online, and Manjula and others who have some experience of work with Jordan, maybe not in an impact evaluation, but have done research to maybe start to think about coming in with their perspective on how it's working, how it could work better. But on that, you're one of them, or at least someone who's done work in the region, and tell us a bit more about sort of your reaction to sort of to Alex's, not too pessimistic assessment on where we are.
I mean, my starting point, I suppose, is it's good to hear more nuance than the book actually gives, because rightly or wrongly, the message from the book that I think has been taken forward by the people like myself, who've read it, and also, let's be honest, it's dropped into a particular political context where certain parts of it has been extracted because it fits a particular political and policy agenda. I think it gives a much more categorical sense that actually SEZs are a much bigger solution than you're now suggesting they might be. You're giving a much more nuanced, problematizing account of what's happening in Jordan than the book perhaps gives. And that's partly because of the passage of time that we now, as you say, this IRC survey of Syrian refugees came out last month. And we have other evidence from ILO, who've been working in the region for some time, about some of the issues around not just SEZs, but also around work permits, of course. I suppose the issue for me is that the focus on Jordan, which I understand in the context of the Syrian issue and in terms of the concerns politically of Europe about people moving across the Mediterranean, and of course the concerns about people drowning in the Mediterranean. It's not unproblematic from the perspective of refugees either, is that this is a £4.2 billion investment ultimately, albeit over a period of time. And that is a very, very significant investment that could otherwise be going on other kinds of things. So yes, it's great to have a pilot, but it's a pretty expensive pilot. And it's one that at the moment, for 40,000 jobs, I think that's quite high. And the reason I suggested that 40,000 the first year wasn't very good is because, and I really hate this expression, but you know where I'm going on it, it's low-hanging fruit. The first year of any pilot is the year where you get the max political and economic commitment. And so we would expect to see a tail-off. And already from some of the evidence coming out of Jordan, we are seeing a tail-off, I would say. Employers are saying it's very difficult. Frankly, the Jordanian labour market is not geared towards a regulated labour market. 40% of the economy is informal. And when you talk to Syrians, albeit who've come from pretty, desperate situations in Syria already, many of the things that they want out of their lives do not involve sitting in a garment factory in an SEZ. That's not the aspiration they have, because they've already lost what they have. So I think we're right to caveat and nuance the Jordan example. My concern, and it's the principal concern, is that when you take a case study like that and you drop it into a political and policy context like the one we're currently living through, when one of the primary objectives of a lot of the refugee policy is containment of one kind or another, whether that's through development or it's through humanitarianism or whatever it is, then it can be utilised and engaged in a way that isn't about what's best for refugees. It isn't about what's best for developing countries. Neither is it about what's best for the global labour market in terms of some of the things that Sarah was talking about, matching the skills of refugees with other gaps in the labour market, that actually that could end up being seen as the solution. And already some of the political debates that I've been listening to have latched on it precisely for that reason. So it's there's partly about the delivery of the pilot, but it's also about the political context into which this is sitting, which is why I always emphasise the rights perspective, not because I'm just doing it for the sake of principle, but because if you want people to be able to have jobs and they have the right to work, which is the primary lever of doing that, they've got to have some other right that gives them the right to work. And in the absence of that, there is no right to work at all.
Thank you. Let's get back to the bigger issues in a moment with others. But can I ask you, the IRC study has been mentioned a couple of times. So Sanjan, if that's okay with you, can you just offer us your perspective about what you found in that study in Jordan in particular, and then I can ask maybe Banjula to come in on more broadly about, her opinion about the viability of special economic zones in different parts of the world.
This isn't on. Okay. I'll try and keep it brief.
Can you introduce yourself, Sanjan?
Yes, I'm Sanj Rakanthan, Deputy Executive Director of IRC UK. The report was really trying to take stock of the work on the Jordan Compact. It echoes some of the things I think that have been said by various members of the panel. Some of the key challenges we're finding is, yes, the job creation mechanisms that are trying to be used through the use of the compact are challenging when getting up to scale. One of the first observations, of course, is the gender disparity between male and female work permit holders, heavily skewed. I think it's still around 4% for women, and that's just a reflection typically in most of these cases. But in this instance, I think some of the structural challenges around how permits are used, how businesses are allowed to be created, and also the flexibility to delink work permits from one particular sector to another within the Jordan context is a challenge. And I think it really speaks to a bigger issue around this alliance of thought around job creation. And I think we all agree jobs for refugees at a very top level is relevant and important. But there are aspects to it that differ in opinion. So some feel that this is a more efficient solution than giving aid, and therefore it's a supplement to what is already a very low threshold of aid. Others feel this is an opportunity to create sustainability and to allow refugees to thrive, which doesn't necessarily mean refugees going for the first job that they get, but the job that's most appropriate to their skills. It's much harder to do that kind of matching than a more low threshold of saying, if they're getting $35 a week of WFP food rations, then if they get a job for roughly around that much, then it saves us the aid distribution and it gives them a sustainable solution. That's not necessarily living or thriving in the view of many refugees. The trouble with the compact is it's designed in many ways to address the most immediate solutions for refugees, which means if there's a job in this sector, we'll create a work permit for that sector. The delinking and the opportunity to create, for example, business booster packages, which we talk about, is around creating new industry and new opportunities for refugees and particularly women to create smaller industries that may not be part of the special economic zones or other formal structures, but still create a more sustainable but more rewarding and opportunity to thrive for refugees as well. So those are really the conclusions we came to at a top level, and I think we're trying to think about how we draw these out across other contexts. Yeah. But I mean, in principle, we agree with the approach on jobs for refugees in Alex's book. I think there's just some nuances that are coming out and are already coming out in some of the comments today, so to be taken forward.
Thank you very much. Let me get back to Manjula. I'm very glad that the issues of sort of women and gender has come up. It's something that is one thing that strikes me and worries me about the debate about jobs for refugees, that we very rarely hear about, specifically, jobs for women and some of the challenges around women and employment, and some generalization about that. Manjula, what's your view? What is your assessment, not just on Jordan, but on the viability of special economic zones as a model, not necessarily a model that works everywhere, but what are your reflections based on your knowledge on labour mobility and labour markets?
Thank you. Makes me make a trip down memory lane, because I used to work on trade before I started working on labour mobility many, many years ago. And you're absolutely right, and your audience is absolutely right in tabling the fact that SCZs, sorry, I'm sitting in America, so it's SCZs here, don't have a great track record, right? We know that, right? I mean, there's a graveyard of SCZs with horrible things written on the tombstones. Now, as a concept, right? As a concept, it's a defensible one, right? And there's learning from failure. As a concept, the idea of an SCZ says it's hard to fix at a national level or a large level a series of problems and obstacles that are getting in the way of production or exports, right? But it may be possible to circumscribe particular areas and fix those problems at that scale. So usually we think of an SCZ as being set up and its ingredients of success lying in proximity, say, to a port, right? So you need to get production into export and out of the country, but somehow the port is in one place and the production facility is in another. So locate an SCZ close to a port. The other is an SCZ works if the whole idea is to cluster economic activity, which is interdependent. So you want garment manufacturers to be sitting next to a dry cleaning shop and a button sewing shop, and that these things are clustered together, and so there's huge economic efficiency where in the production space, right? So that's another reason why SCZs could work. And then the third, which is perhaps the biggest reason why SCZs are extremely attractive in developing countries, is because of services. Services like, say, water or electricity, which most governments find for a series of reasons, and they're very different reasons in different contexts, where you can't have reliable electricity in the entire city or that region, but we will assure that in this particular SCZ, you will not have power failures. Power quite common in so many parts of the world. So infrastructure it'll take a long time to fix the roads and electricity and water supply in this city, but we can fix it at this scale fairly quickly. Right? So these are sort of the reasons why SCZs are proposed, and when they don't work, it's because either neither of these were the problem in export in the first place, yeah, and that's happened quite often, that the obstacles to export are not fixed through these three things. Maybe it was just an issue of an uncompetitive structure in the first place. In the context of Jordan now, right? It is, again, a fantastic space for innovation where we're trying to use, and I think Alex described this well, trying to use the globalization process, the production chains, which are spread out across the world, but still integrated, to actually activate and create job creation. And I would therefore consider that one of the, perhaps, Alex, you mentioned you might consider doing a serious monitoring and evaluation of this. And clearly the number of jobs created for Syrian refugees or work permits created, or the number of jobs that moved from being the informal sector to the formal sector are absolutely parameters of success. But I would wonder if we also wanted to find a way to also measure, or at least acknowledge, the ability and the need for these SEZs as emerging from the need to unlock and change the discourse that is currently so powerful, that refugees are taking away natives' jobs, and move that discourse to one where you can perhaps frame this as an expansion of the pie, right? An expansion of economic activity, not just for refugees, but for natives and for that part of the world. I think if that discourse starts to shift, we're on much better ground already.
Okay. Thank you, Manjula. That's and thank you for this reflection and sort of opening up. I mean, I am struck by how much of this debate focuses in on jobs for refugees and the need to be specific about, you know, the specific issues and needs and protection needs of refugees. But you know how the benefit of opening up to the broader context around it. Saira, a number of people have mentioned the importance of taking refugees' views into consideration. A number of people actually do it, but Heaven just mentioned earlier how sometimes, you know, the aspirations are actually different from the one that are assumed, and particularly when it comes to jobs. What are you learning about, what, you know, the actual aspirations and specific needs of different types of refugees when it comes to employment, and how central to their aspiration employment is?
As you would all expect, it's certainly central to every family we've spoken to. We started our work by doing dozens and dozens of focus group discussions and individual interviews, not just with Syrians, but other refugees as well, including Palestinians in these groups. And people were very frank with us, we thought, about what they would be willing to do, where they'd be willing to move or not, for what job or not. I mean, people are already moving, of course, as you know, for job opportunities and safety. And many of them that we talked to said, if there was a legal pathway, I would wait to move my family for that. But right now, we're trying to decide whether to go try to get on a boat in Tripoli, in Lebanon. So, of course, families are faced right now with these very difficult decisions. So opening up a labor pathway, even if it is to maybe a middle-income country like Morocco, it's not Canada or Australia, the refugees we've talked to said they're very interested. Now, it remains to be seen what will actually happen when we start moving forward. People will, of course, drop out of this pipeline just as they do for resettlement. So I look to you all, including the IRC and others, to work with us on developing our lessons learned, doing impact evaluations, looking how people moving through this pathway were impacted, not just in terms of income, but integration, and look at their motivations for moving as well. As Sanj was saying, is it just about this is the only option, or is it about the public policies in that country? There could be a variety of things to look at. So I hope you'll consider working with us, and then we'll be in the hot seat soon.
Thank you. So let me get back to you and your question. Let me start with somebody who is asking a question online that I suspect some of you in the room may be in a position to answer, not just the panel. So this is Inga Storen, a PhD candidate at Oxford, so I'm afraid somebody that probably you know well, who wants to know about entrepreneurship training for refugees and access to startup loans for refugees. I mean, here somebody mentioned how a lot of this discourse is state-centric, is about creating employment opportunities, but perhaps Sanjay and others who have something to offer on what we know about entrepreneurship and startup loans as an example of employment. But let me open the floor to others. There's one here. This is the last round. We got just about just about 15 minutes, so we'll all need to be even briefer than earlier. Please.
Sure, I'll be brief. Thank you. My name's Stephen Ayres. I work for the International Development Committee of the House of Commons. We recently were doing an inquiry into forced displacement in East Africa, which was unfortunately dropped due to the election and Parliament coming to an end. But one of the things that focused on was Kenya and the sort of change of policy towards Somali refugees in Kenya and the closure of Dadaab camp. And excuse me. And one of the sort of issues around that was raised by ODI and its written evidence, saying that Kenyan ministers had actually indicated that part of the reason behind that drove that sort of policy change was that European countries were not being particularly, were not willing to share the burden of refugees. So my question is really sort of to what extent in driving change in the system and how we deal with displacement, to what extent have donor countries kind of, do they have the political capital or leverage or sort of moral ground to really drive that change?
Thank you. Thank you. You're lucky enough that one of the author of that report is in the room, and she might want to come in and say something about it, just given the hint. But let's go. I'll give you 2 minutes to think, and somebody else at the back there.
Thank you. Hi. I'm Sang Jong-ha from European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Economic Inclusion team. Under the Jordan Compact, the EBRD has been also working on providing economic opportunities for refugees as part of the investment, and we have been actually working in Jordan. And just to share a few insights in the implementation of the work permits and the view of the private sector, we have been working with employers inside, in the economic zones as well as outside of the zones to provide job opportunities for refugees. And one lesson we learned is that communication is absolutely key for the private sector. There's lots of interest that we hear. However, the implementation of work permits and administration is often sometimes not very clear in terms of the openness of the jobs or certain functions that are closed. So we learned that communication is the key. And the second factor to consider is the vulnerability and protection of refugees in the labor relations. Because of their status of refugees, when it comes to labor relations, they're often subject to additional vulnerability compared to local employees, especially in special economic zones. That's another lesson. Yeah. And the third lesson, finally, is the enabling conditions. Jobs are important, but we hear commuting is a constant challenge for refugees, as well as childcare. So it's important to also put in place certain enabling environment to enable job matching.
This is clearly sort of an emerging sort of trend in a lot of the comments, also from the panel. But I mean, the specific issues about and whether there is anything that you're learning, you and others in Jordan, about this potential problem with the realities and of local populations, particularly informal workers and other forms of non-protected migrants, seems to me important. Let me see if there are, there are too many. One here first, and Karen, I'll come to you before the end, and one here at the front.
Hey, thank you very much. My name is Anne Wegner. I'm a PhD student from the University of Edinburgh, and I work on...
Not Oxford, go on.
No. And I work on Syrian refugees in the north of Jordan, but in urban Jordan. This is mostly a response to Alexander Batz and Manjula. So I feel, first, I take issue with Manjula's distinction between economic migrants and refugees, because one thing to understand about the Levant is that current trajectories of displacement are embedded in long-standing pre-war mobility schemes, and in particular, long-standing pre-war labor migration schemes. And this has been well documented for the case of Lebanon, for instance. Like, according to different stats, we've had hundreds of thousands of Syrian migrant workers in Lebanon before the war. So one thing to understand is that when the war breaks out, people don't just get stranded anywhere, and they don't just go to places where they have family, but they also go to places where they know there are jobs and they already have employment networks. Which leads to my second point, which is, are jobs the answer? Well, no, because people are already working. Like in the north of Jordan, everybody was working, because one thing to understand is that humanitarian assistance alone is not enough of a lifeline. Now, do people work informally? Yes, they do, and they often work under exploitative conditions. And I feel that the work permit initiative is a well-meant initiative, but we've already heard all kind of reasons why this doesn't work out on the ground, including the highly informal nature of the Jordanian economy. Okay. Now, people work. What do they need? What they do need is not more jobs. What they need is to have their rights protected. In particular, concretely, in the Jordanian case, that means we have to put pressure on the Jordanian government to stop deporting Syrians back to Syria, in particular Syrian workers who get caught working informally. And we need to guarantee Syrian children's right of access to Jordanian schools, because technically Syrian children are entitled.
I'll have to stop you there because I want to hear from others. There's one here at the front. It's Martin. Can we hear one, please? And I'll take one more and then we'll come back to the panel.
My name is Martin Barber. I'm a former UN official, and I hope you'll allow me a very quick comment on the book as a whole. I joined UNHCR in 1975, and I've actually been waiting for this book more or less since then.
I thought you might have.
I absolutely take the comments made by Heaven, and while I was reading it, my neighbours may have complained because quite frequently I said, "Oh, nonsense." But more frequently I said, "Finally, exactly, please listen to this." So my comment would be, anybody who hasn't actually read the book, don't be put off. Read the whole thing.
Thank you, and it's especially, I think, interesting and refreshing to get, somebody who comes from within the sector made that comment. Colleagues of mine said, sometimes this is a book where everybody who's been working around refugees feels the need to be, to be against, whereas this is, we're clearly opened up the discussion much more broadly. So thank you very much for that. Let me take one more question over there. Took a few from ODI, so one over there.
Thank you. My name is Shalini Raste. I'm an economic development consultant at the Palladium Group. Strikes me that the key tension, or one of the main tensions here, is the sort of tension between refugees being privileged over citizens in the host country. So I think jobs is certainly, to me, it seems like part of the solution. Is actually the crux of it is the type of job? So is it really about looking at the types of jobs which encourage repatriation? So specifically, I'm thinking, industries where you're trying to create productive value chains that are export-oriented, remittances, the role of the banks, how do you repatriate funds, wages, that type of thing. Reconstructive industries, which are very focused on, because, if there's a conflict, then it stands to reason those people are going to have to go back and play a role in reconstruction. And then fourth and fifth, entrepreneurship-heavy industries. So I think there's a real role for entrepreneur-heavy industries. And then, crucially, mobile industries. So thinking about sort of technology-focused as part of this, rather than, I absolutely understand the role of basic industries, textiles, but actually is there a technology element here?
Thank you. Thank you. Karen, I think you're going to be my first response from the panel, meaning that we can hear on your opinion about the ripple effects of European policies elsewhere in the world, and then we'll come back.
Karen Hargrave from the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. Well, first of all, it's great to hear that the International Development Committee took such notice of our, of our report and their evidence. It's always it's nice to hear that. I suppose what was interesting for us in that study is sort of shifting the perspective and looking at how both the sort of discussions we're having today and the sort of European politicking that's part of it and exists around it looks from the global south, sort of shifting that perspective. And what was interesting is how that was seen both as sort of raised in the comments, both from the side of Kenyan officials, which was very concerning to us, but also from the Kenyan public. We looked at Kenyans on Twitter who were sort of tweeting about European policy and how shameful it looked to them, having hosted so many refugees in their country for so many years. And so I'm interested to hear if Alex has any reflections around the Jordan Compact and his work related to it, and how he thinks that's been seen from the global south, and whether there's any insights he has.
Thank you, Karen. Let me come back to the panel. Alex first, and a couple of others. You'll need to pick up only one or two questions. Annie, let me use my privilege as a chair to say I'm worried about this tension between rights and jobs. I'm worried that this idea that is not jobs is rights, and I'm sure that's not what is meant. But can maybe comment on that a little bit about how do we handle this issue?
Yeah, let me start there.
Yeah.
I think, Anne, while you were asking your question, I was thinking jobs in a way is a really inadequate, unsatisfactory concept. I think economic empowerment is a much better, broader idea. And the comment made by the lady from EBRD about enabling environments, I think, is the ideal that we should have as the metric. Jobs don't matter as an objective in and of themselves. They matter as a means to an end. They are a means through which you facilitate human flourishing. Now, a big part of that that's been neglected is the socio-economic rights dimension of refugees' experience. The second half of the convention is socio-economic rights, and we largely drop that. And so it is about legal frameworks. It is about the protection framework in the host country. But the availability of sources of employment is key to that. Now, there's going to be certain contexts where the informal sector serves those objectives. There are going to be certain contexts where, for some people, the informal sector is extremely exploitative for young people who are kept out of schools to work to support their families, for people who are on extremely low wages and face violations of their civil and political rights through being in exploitative informal labour markets. But I think the aspiration has to be, how do we move towards a context where the countries that are hosting lots of refugees create those enabling environments in which people flourish, are autonomous, and can determine what they want to do on the basis of their aspirations. In many host countries, for a whole variety of reasons, it's very difficult to go straight from A to Z. So we need to think seriously about, politically, how we move along those steps. And I think we need to be critical about the concept of jobs, because it can be quite distorting. And I take seriously Heaven's point that dropping ideas into political context can lead them to be distorted and misused. And I recognise that aspects of some of these ideas are open to that. But I think we need to recognise that the end point is that. Kenya, and Karen's point about ripple effects. I mean, the ripple effect stuff has been documented by you at ODI. It's in a lot of Heaven's work. And I think it's right. The fact that 19th of September at the UN, Kenya was pointing to the hypocrisy of the European Union to say this is why we're threatening to expel Somalis. But it's also, Kenya's complex. We've done a lot of recent data collection in Kenya. And there is no single Kenyan refugee policy. The policy in Dadaab is not the policy in Nairobi, is not the policy in Kakuma. In Kakuma and the surrounding area, local authorities are relaxed about people working for NGOs, working for international organisations, working for the informal sector, partly because the surrounding Turkana population depends upon the presence of refugees for its economic opportunities. They're often worse off than refugees, but they have their livelihoods because of the presence of refugees, and that shapes the local politics. The key is to recognise, in a not one-size-fits-all way, the granularity of the politics at the national and local level in host countries, and look at who is the gatekeeper, who is rejecting what on the basis of what interests. And you often get Minister of Defence, Minister for Home Affairs, playing the hypocrisy of the global north, but you have very different dynamics at the local level. And one of the arguments in the book is we need much more nuanced political analysis from UNHCR that up until recently hasn't hired people as political analysts to work out the nuance. So if we have an international system that's capable of economic and development analysis, capable of political analysis, then on a country-specific basis, and hopefully we can think about this in the Refugee Compact, we can work out plans that move us from no socioeconomic rights to socioeconomic flourishing while working with the politics and the policy constraints. And that's the project I want to be part of. And one more sentence. To Martin's point, this has been one of the hardest books for me to be involved in writing. I'm not used to being criticised by left-wing academics. I'm used to...
A bit. Characterisation.
Whether Heaven's part of that or not, and there are other people. I'm used to being criticised by the right and by the establishment for advocating for refugee rights and entitlements. And in case this is on record, I'm not going to comment directly on that. But there are elements of the positive reception of this book that have emotionally unsettled me. And this is the only book that I've lost sleep over. But part of that is because I think these ideas are hard. They're politically challenging in a world in which it's not easy to achieve socioeconomic rights, opportunities for human flourishing to refugees. And I think I read it as academics having a moral obligation to think seriously through trade-offs and try to do things that can provide ideas for real-world change. I don't claim this is the only way to do that. I welcome debate, but I actually think this is complex and messy, and sometimes it's too easy to always take the moral high ground and have everyone as your friend.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you very much for this very sort of personal and sort of honest reaction. We're going to go over 5 or 6 minutes. Can I ask all the others to give us one final thought, and then I'll close and all of us have a drink and we can continue the discussion over a glass of wine, of course.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with the characterisation of me, but that's another issue.
General character, not personal.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important discussion, and I have been very critical of the book, not just because of the SEZs, but because of the way it's been politically interpreted, because I think that people are looking for, let's be honest, academics from good universities to kind of legitimate some of the not very good things that they're doing, frankly. So there is a kind of political context to which this is playing. And I do think the starting point of comparative advantage is probably the wrong one, personally, because I think that we need to get out of the kind of us and them scenario. We need to be looking at much more of the kind of things that Syra and people like her are doing, which is to think about this as a global labour market, not a labour market in the regions from which refugees are coming or oriented. So, and I really don't think there is a tension between rights and jobs. I think that jobs will flow once people have rights. Half of the countries that have signed up to the convention have agreed that rights for employment are important and should be given, but they're not delivering. And if we can kind of leverage that, then we don't need these very complicated, very difficult, very expensive schemes, because actually you've got a starting point, which is people have rights and a way into the existing labour market, and then you have to adapt that labour market accordingly. But I think we could do much more with $4.2 billion around training, entrepreneurship, credit, all sorts of really creative things that aren't just in Jordan and aren't just in relation to the compact.
Thank you. Manjula, I'm tempted to ask you about the sequencing between rights and jobs, but I won't. One final thoughts from you.
Yes, I wish I could continue talking to all of you over a glass of wine, but I'm only halfway through my work. I just wanted to pick up quickly on a point that one of your audience members made and then tie it into the conversation you're having now in closing. The point about, are we fussed too much about this difference between migrants and refugees? Yeah? I actually agree with your audience member. As I said earlier, that they're in search of the same thing, right? Both of these populations want the same thing. They want dignity. They want a better life for their families. They want basic services like anybody else does. They move for different reasons, and that matters a whole lot in the first few years, and it starts to matter less and less after the first few years when you're actually focusing on their integration. Now, in terms of integration, look, I mean, at the moment, roughly sort of the rule of thumb we seem to come away with on refugee populations is that about a third stay, about a third go back home, and about a third go elsewhere. Yeah? So there is the issue of what do you do beyond the first few years of their arrival when you're in this emergency response mode. And not everybody has the luxury of going back home. I do want to, though, defend the notion that they are actually, for policy making, completely different populations. Refugees are a global public good because the hosting countries are performing a global public good and a service for the world, without which we would have a global public bad that looks a whole lot more bad than what we have now. And it's precisely because host countries are providing this global public good that we're actually coming together with financing, with other stakeholders, to actually see if we can, even in the smallest way, change that discourse about natives versus refugees or about jobs versus rights, right? That's why this is such a difficult issue. This doesn't have the same sorts of issues associated with it that labor migrants do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Manjula, and thank you for joining us from Washington, and I hope to see you in person very soon. One very final thought from Sarah. You have to be really quick.
I am excited. Next time, we need to bring the private sector into these conversations more. They have ideas on how to do skills assessment, integrate people into the workplace. They have ideas on policy changes that are necessary on a national or global scale. So I think, in addition to the academic minds and practitioners, it's exciting that at least there's private sector interest at this point as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all very much for coming today. Thank you in particular to the speakers, and particularly for the frankness and honesty and open-mindedness that they brought to this discussion, which clearly is the beginning, and there is a lot more that we're going to hear. Thank you to our audiences online. I thought we had a really interesting discussion tonight, which I very much hope to continue to have with a number of you. I leave with two thoughts that are sort of a little bit niggling at the back of my mind. One is that it's good to have nuance, context, and sure, we need impact evaluation, but these are also words that worry me a little bit. And so we need to make sure that we don't now sit back. I think you make a bold statement that there is a need for, and I think there is enough out there, including the studies that many are doing, for example, on how SEZs are working in Jordan. But as Manjula said, we know about how they worked in the past. So let's work with it. Let's work the problem, not let's now sort of sit back and just reiterate that context matters, because that, as I said, sometimes worries me. And finally, it seems to me that a conversation about jobs and refugees cannot be confined to neighboring countries. I think that this needs to be a conversation on the global scales, including jobs, refugees in the host countries that is, where we live, where, of course, politically this matters and is difficult, but I don't think really we can avoid it. So